February 24, 1603. Richmond Palace. A dying woman whispers a confession meant for a queen. A secret that will shatter the most powerful monarch in Europe. Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, clutches the hand of the woman she served for 45 years. With her final breath, she reveals a truth she has carried for 2 years. A ring. A message of peace from the Earl of Essex, intercepted and hidden. A chance for mercy that Queen Elizabeth never knew existed. The Queen's reaction is visceral. She strikes the dying woman, screaming that God may forgive her, but she, the Queen, never will. This moment marks the beginning of the end. Not just of a reign that transformed England, but of a woman whose final days would be so horrific, so undignified, that those who witnessed them could barely record what they saw. What happened to Elizabeth I in those last weeks reads like a Gothic horror story. A woman who spent 45 years in absolute control would die standing up, refusing to lie down for 4 straight days. A queen whose face was a mask of toxic lead paint, so thick it cracked. A body so deteriorated it would literally explode in its coffin during the funeral procession. This is the story of how the Virgin Queen, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada, spent her final days in a nightmare of her own making. By February 1603, Elizabeth was already fragile. At 69 years old, she had outlived almost everyone she had ever trusted. But Catherine Howard's deathbed confession was not just another loss. It was the revelation that destroyed her spirit. The French ambassador reported that Elizabeth fell into a deep melancholy with a conceit of her own death. She began complaining of sudden infirmities that appeared from nowhere. Her ladies noticed she would sit for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally breaking into tears. But it wasn't just Catherine's betrayal that haunted her. As her body weakened, the ghosts of her past came flooding back. Sir Robert Carey, present in those final weeks, witnessed something extraordinary. The Queen, racked with guilt over decisions made decades earlier, began crying about Mary, Queen of Scots. 16 years had passed since Mary's execution. Yet, here was Elizabeth weeping, and according to Carey, manifesting her innocence, that she had never given consent for the death of that queen. The guilt she had suppressed for so long was now consuming her. And Mary was not the only ghost. Elizabeth became fixated on Catherine Grey, another woman with royal blood, whom Elizabeth had imprisoned until her death. Catherine's grandson, Edward Seymour, was now circling like a vulture, waiting for Elizabeth to die so he could claim her throne. The irony was not lost on the dying queen. While Elizabeth's mind crumbled, her body staged its own revolt. The physical deterioration was nothing short of nightmarish. By January, a simple cold had evolved into something far worse. Contemporary sources describe a deflection in the throat. What modern pathologists now believe was quinsy peritonsillar abscess. Imagine your throat swelling shut from the inside, filled with pus, making every swallow feel like broken glass. The Venetian ambassador reported her throat showed infected glands, like almonds, swollen, painful, and oozing. But the throat infection was just the beginning. Elizabeth's teeth, what few remained, were black stumps of decay. Decades of sugar consumption, combined with mercury treatments, had rotted them from the inside out. The dental abscesses were so severe the infection spread to her neck glands. She could not eat. She could barely drink. The pain was constant, excruciating. Then came the discovery that horrified her courtiers. Her coronation ring, the symbol of her marriage to England, worn for 45 years, had grown into her flesh. William Camden recorded the grotesque detail. The ring had so grown into her flesh that it could not be drawn off. Think of that. The ring had been there so long, through decades of swelling, that her finger had literally grown around it. They had to file through the gold as she watched. The metal was embedded so deep in her swollen flesh it left a permanent groove in the bone. The cutting of the ring was not just physically painful, it was symbolically devastating. Camden noted it was a sad presage, as if the marriage with her kingdom would be dissolved. The quinsy in Elizabeth's throat was one symptom of a body in total systemic failure. Dr. Lister, one of her physicians, later described symptoms he was too frightened to record while she lived. Her urine had turned dark brown, a sign of kidney failure, likely from decades of mercury and lead poisoning. Her legs were so swollen with edema her shoes had to be cut off. The swelling extended to her abdomen, making breathing difficult. In her final week, she developed what appears to have been pneumonia. Witnesses described her breathing as a rattling death, with coughing fits that brought up blood-tinged sputum. The combination of the throat infection, pneumonia, and fluid in her lungs meant she was essentially drowning. But perhaps most disturbing were the neurological symptoms. Beyond memory loss and confusion, Elizabeth began experiencing what her ladies called fits. She would suddenly go rigid, her eyes rolling back, her body trembling. Modern physicians suggest these were likely seizures, caused by lead poisoning reaching critical levels in her brain. The royal physicians tried everything. They attempted to bleed her, but she refused. They prepared poultices of horse dung and wine, the standard treatment, but she would not let them near her. Dr. Lister wrote that she would not suffer any physical medicine, convinced the doctors were trying to poison her. In desperation, they tried to feed her cordial broths through a tube, but her throat was too swollen. For the last 3 days of her life, she consumed nothing but a few spoonfuls of sugared water. But perhaps the most insidious killer was something Elizabeth applied to herself every single day: her makeup. For over 40 years, she had painted her face with Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. Every morning, layers of this toxic paste were applied to hide smallpox scars and maintain the illusion of eternal youth. The lead seeped through her skin, accumulating in her body, slowly poisoning her from the outside in. By 1603, the symptoms were undeniable. Her hair had fallen out in clumps, leaving her nearly bald. She wore increasingly elaborate wigs to hide it. Her memory, once sharp enough to speak 6 languages, began to fail. She would forget names, lose track of conversations. Modern toxicologists identify classic signs of chronic lead poisoning: the hair loss, the cognitive decline, the muscle weakness. The makeup that had protected her image for decades had become her slow executioner. The more the lead damaged her skin, the more makeup she needed. A vicious, toxic cycle that only ended with death. The Venetian ceruse was just the beginning. For her blood-red lips, she used vermilion mercuric sulfide. Mercury absorbed through the lips causes neurological damage and kidney failure. Elizabeth's handwriting in her final years shows a telltale tremor. For her eyes, she used belladonna drops to dilate her pupils. Belladonna means beautiful lady, but its other name is deadly nightshade. Regular use causes hallucinations, confusion, and vision problems. By 1603, Elizabeth could barely see. But nothing was more bizarre than what happened in early March. Elizabeth developed an irrational, absolute terror of lying down. She became convinced that if she went to bed, she would never rise again. She literally refused to lie down. For 15 hours straight, she stood in her chambers. Her ladies watched in horror as their 69-year-old queen, sick and dying, stood motionless. When her legs gave out, she didn't go to bed. She collapsed onto cushions on the floor, and there she stayed. For 4 consecutive days and nights, Elizabeth sat on those cushions. She did not speak. She refused all food, all drink, all medicine. Robert Carey described the scene. She sat with her finger in her mouth in complete silence, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her courtiers were beside themselves. The Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, tried to reason with her. When he suggested she must go to bed, Elizabeth snapped back with one of her last coherent statements: "Must is not a word to use to princes." Finally, Charles Howard, the Earl of Nottingham, had seen enough. On March 21st, he physically forced her to bed. Robert Carey's account is telling. What by fair means, what by force, he got her to bed. They had to carry the Queen of England. And once there, she never rose again. During those 4 days on the cushions, a careful watch was organized. Her ladies took shifts, never leaving her alone. Lady Warwick later wrote that the Queen would occasionally reach out and grab whoever was nearest, holding their hand with surprising strength, then releasing them without a word. The Countess of Nottingham tried to feed her, kneeling with a silver bowl of broth. Elizabeth would turn her head away. Once, when the Countess persisted, Elizabeth suddenly grabbed the bowl and threw it across the room. At night, dozens of candles burned. Elizabeth was terrified of the dark. When she dozed, still sitting upright, her ladies held their breath. But her eyes would snap open, wild and frightened. Lady Scrope recorded that on the 3rd night, Elizabeth began pointing at the corner of the room, following something no one else could see. She shook her head violently, as if arguing with an invisible presence. March 23, 1603. Elizabeth lay dying, and England held its breath. For 45 years, she had refused to name an heir. Now, the Privy Council faced a crisis. They gathered around her bed. Robert Cecil leaned close and listed possible successors. When he mentioned James VI of Scotland, something happened. According to Robert Carey, Elizabeth put her hand to her head. The council interpreted this as her making the sign of a crown, her consent for James to inherit. But other witnesses claimed she made no gesture at all. Some said she was already unconscious. The crown gesture may have been a convenient fiction, political cover for a decision the council had already made. The ambiguity was perfect F. Or Cecil, who had been secretly corresponding with James for years. While Elizabeth lay dying, Richmond Palace became a snake pit of conspiracy. The Earl of Northumberland was stockpiling weapons. Lord Cobham gathered supporters for Arbella Stewart. But Cecil was 10 steps ahead. He had drafted a proclamation declaring James king, dated it for the future, and stationed riders at every major road. The transition was choreographed down to the minute. Sir Robert Carey had his own agenda. His sister, Lady Scrope, was at Elizabeth's bedside to grab the sapphire ring the moment the Queen died. Carey had 3 horses stationed along the road to Scotland. That evening, Archbishop John Whitgift was summoned. The 73-year-old archbishop found Elizabeth barely conscious. He began to pray. He prayed for so long his old knees grew weary, and he tried to leave. But Elizabeth, who hadn't spoken in days, made a sign for him to continue. He prayed for another half hour, with what witnesses called earnest cries to God for her soul's health, which the Queen much rejoiced thereat. Then, she fell into a deep sleep. Between 2 and 3 in the morning on March 24, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor died. The witnesses described it poetically, mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from the tree. The Virgin Queen was dead. But her body's final horror was yet to come. The moment Elizabeth died, the machinery of succession kicked into gear. Lady Scrope wrenched the sapphire ring from Elizabeth's still warm finger and dropped it from a window to her brother, Robert Carey, waiting below. He was in the saddle and galloping north before the death bells rang. Carey's ride to Scotland was legendary. His first horse collapsed just past York. The second got him to the Scottish border, where he fell and was kicked in the head, opening a bloody gash. He fought off border raiders and continued riding. He reached Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh on the evening of March 26th, covering nearly 400 miles in just 60 hours. He knelt by the king's bedside and hailed him as King of England, presenting the sapphire ring as proof. Elizabeth had been explicit. She did not want to be disemboweled after death. Robert Cecil ignored her wishes completely. Her body was embalmed and sealed in a lead-lined coffin. For over a month, it lay in state. Then, during the funeral procession to Westminster Abbey on April 28th, it happened. Attendants heard a loud crack from inside the coffin. The decomposition gases that had built up inside the sealed lead coffin had nowhere to go. The pressure built until the body exploded. Some accounts describe it as sounding like a cannon shot. The attendants, horrified, continued the procession, carrying a coffin containing the exploded remains. The funeral was a production worthy of the Queen. Over 1,600 official mourners. The streets draped in black. The coffin, covered in purple velvet, bore the crown, orb, and scepter. But the real genius was the effigy on top. Modeled by Maximilian Colt, it was so lifelike people gasped. The face was painted with white lead. The red hair was a silk wig. It was Elizabeth as she wanted to be remembered, not the bald, toothless, lead-poisoned creature who had actually died. When embalmers had prepared her body, they found a woman unrecognizable from her portraits. The lead makeup was a cracked shell. When they cleaned it, it came off in sheets, revealing damaged, discolored skin beneath. Most of her hair was gone. Her teeth were black stumps. She was initially interred in her grandfather Henry VII vault. But in 1606, James I had her moved to share a tomb with her half-sister, Mary I, the very sister Elizabeth had lived in terror of. The inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of the resurrection." The irony would have infuriated Elizabeth. In the days following her death, her favorite spaniel refused to leave her room. It sat by her empty bed, howling mournfully for days, until it was removed by force. It died within a week, having refused all food. Her collection of over 3,000 dresses was catalogued, but many were rotting from the inside out. The lead from her makeup had transferred to the fabric, eating through silk and velvet like acid. Her cosmetics table was left exactly as it was. Pots of half-used ceruse, vermilion, belladonna drops. Cecil ordered everything burned, but not before one courtier recorded that the smell was most foul and pestilent. Elizabeth I's death was a masterclass in the price of absolute power. Every decision she had made to maintain control of the toxic makeup, the refusal to name an heir, the isolation came back to destroy her in the end. The lead that gave her the face of a queen slowly poisoned her. Her refusal to show weakness left her dying on floor cushions. The ghosts of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catherine Grey haunted her final hours. She died as she had lived, alone, defiant, and desperately trying to control an image that had cracked beyond repair. The explosion of her corpse feels almost metaphorical, the final, violent rejection of the imprisonment she had placed on herself. Elizabeth gave everything to be queen. In the end, that crown cost her everything that makes us human. She died not as a woman, but as a grotesque monument to her own power. Painted, poisoned, and ultimately, utterly alone.